Have you ever wondered why so many Beatles songs seem to stick around forever? Well, this video will show you one of the many secrets that the Beatles and other songwriting masters throughout history share when it comes to writing melodies and how you can use the same techniques for writing your own songs. Before proceeding, I highly recommend that you have a basic knowledge of scales, intervals, and how basic triads are built. There are tons of great resources on YouTube, and you only need to have a basic grasp that shouldn't take too long to learn. David Bennett has a great video that will give you an introduction to basic music theory concepts in just 29 minutes. When beginner songwriters start learning about gluing together their melodies and chord progressions, a common question asked is, what chords should go under which notes? Or vice versa, what notes of my melody should go over my chord choices? The common advice is often to suggest matching notes from the chords to the notes of the melody and to avoid notes that create tension and dissonance in strong positions of the beat. An example being if, in the key of C major, and dealing with the chords C, F, and G, is to use the following notes. Any other notes from the scale that don't belong in the specific chord are recommended to be de-emphasized, because they supposedly don't fit and create dissonance, such as This advice, though, ignores the fact that the Beatles did the complete opposite of that, and in fact wrote outstanding melodies because of their defiance of common wisdom. Using notes over a triad that do not belong to the prevailing chord, especially in strong positions, do attract positive attention because of their dissonance. And when that dissonance is resolved in the following notes, melodic satisfaction occurs. As you listen to this short section, pay attention to the highlighted notes.
Yesterday, all my troubles seem so far away.
These specific notes stand out because they are not actually a part of either chord highlighted. Right off the bat, the syllable yes is a G note, sung over an F chord, which normally contains the notes F, A, C. And having the vocal adding the G note almost sounds like a suspended chord. And far is sung as an E over a D minor chord, which contains the notes D, F, and A. The note that stands out the most is far, especially because it's in a climactic position and is an accented position on the one beat. These are called non-chord tones. The Beatles ubiquitously use these non-chord tones in strong accented positions in countless amounts of their timeless classics, and this video will demonstrate where they are used and why they are important. Different types of accented non-chord tones exist, such as appoggiaturas, suspensions, and other ornamentation that results in the accented tone being outside of the chord. The names aren't that important outside of academic theory discussions, but the fact that they exist in strong accented positions is important. When I speak of accented positions, by the way, I refer to beats 1 and 3 in common meter or 4/4 time, and beat 1 in 3/4 time. These are the strongest positions in that type of meter, and notes that occur on those beats can really stand out. In 6/8 time, the accented beats would be 1 and 4, when counting. The next part of the phrase in yesterday also contains an accented non-chord tone that also really stands out.
Now it looks as though they're here to stay. Oh,
Paul actually sings a B-flat note over that F chord, which some lead sheet music sources notate some of these chords differently, such as B-flat with an F as the bass note. But that's most likely because if they use any software to transcribe the chords, non-chord tones in the vocals can confuse the software into thinking it's a complex chord with an extension or alternate bass note. Even human transcribers can sometimes hear that effect as well when the string arrangements are mixed in with Paul's acoustic guitar track. The songs In My Life and Get Back have a great example of using vocal notes to create seventh chords, extensions, and will be discussed shortly. If no non-chord tones are present in a melody on accented positions, What often happens is that the melody and chords mush up together and don't create any contrast or highlights. This is a very common mistake that both your average songwriter and even many experienced producers make. Here's what the melody of Yesterday would sound like if it didn't have these non-chord tones.
Yesterday, all my troubles seem so far away. All my troubles seem so far away. Now it looks as though they're here to stay. Oh, now it looks as though they're here to stay. Oh,
It just doesn't sound as good as before, when the non-chord tones created tension that got resolved. Even after I changed the high note on one of those examples. Actually, all those modifications sound rather boring. If you or your producer aren't aware of the importance of non-chord tones, it's likely that you might end up snapping them to the scale grid during mixing if you are using any sort of pitch correction software or plugins, and could end up sounding like those altered examples. This could be a big mistake, missing out on the opportunity to create attention-grabbing effects with tension. Here's how In My Life makes use of non-chord tones in accented positions. In My Life does use multi-part vocal harmonies in the melody, but for these examples, I'm only focusing on the first part to illustrate these concepts without too much complexity. This is the vocal part that a solo performer would sing if they are just by themselves with a backing instrument to play the chords.
There are places I remember.
Similar to the song Yesterday, the note used in the syllable place, sung as a B note. Over an A major chord on beat 1 almost sounds like a different chord because of its accented position. The A major chord contains the notes A, C sharp, and E, and the added B note creates the illusion of some type of suspended chord that resolves back to the major chord. It sounds like a sus2 chord or an add2 chord when all the instruments and vocals are combined. But on the syllable mem, an E note is sung over an F sharp minor chord, which sounds like an F sharp minor 7th chord. Again, some sheet music sources do notate it like that as it's heard, similar to notation errors in Yesterday. But if you listen closely to the original recording, the band only plays an F sharp minor triad, and the main part of the vocals, ignoring harmonies, are performing that E note. This is a great way to perform extended chords. By deliberately writing the vocal melody with the extension as the non-chord tone compared to the default triad, and when all played together, it sounds striking and harmonically rich.
As I remember.
The next accented non-chord tone occurs on the syllable lie,
All my life, though some had changed.
which is sung as a B note over a D major chord and creates the sound of a D6th chord before it goes into a melisma over the D minor chord. A melisma is just when a syllable is extended to 2 or more additional notes. It's a beautiful sound, and adding the non-chord tones in the vocal melody can create that effect of extended chords, even though that's not what the other instruments in the band are playing. But again, the power that vocals especially have to the human ear and brain make us perceive it that way. The next sections of the song also have lots of accented non-chord tones.
All these places at the moment.
The syllable mo is sung as a C sharp note over a D major chord on the strong beat 1, which creates the new sound of a D major 7th chord. It's a very haunting sound. The last section of the song contains 2 more distinct accented non-chord tones.
Some are dead and some are living. In my life, I love them all.
The syllable live is also sung as a C sharp note, but this time over a B major chord which contains the notes B, D, and F sharp. Or some other sources say a B dominant 7th chord. Either way, the C sharp note over either of those chords on beat 1 creates an even more interesting sound. Though an important thing to note is that the more notes you have in a triad and the more complex the chord is, the less of an effect a non-chord tone sung with the vocal will have, as it can get buried within the backing chord. This is why it's a good idea when you write songs with very complex chords to save them for spots in instrumental breaks, or when the vocals aren't performing extended notes like 6ths or 7th degrees of the prevailing scale and key. It's tempting to use rich and harmonic chords, but you can miss out on the potential effect of accented non-chord tones in the vocal if you aren't cognizant of where to place them. The last accented non-chord tone in the song is the syllable lie, but this time sung as a C note, over the D minor chord, which contains the notes D, F, and A, and sounds like a D minor 7th chord. Then it does another melisma in the melody, similar to the previous section, but with different notes. Again, another beautiful effect. Here's what the sections of the song might sound like if accented non-chord tones weren't used.
There are places I remember. There are places I remember. All my life, though some had changed. All my life, though some had changed. All these places at their moments remain. All these places at their moments. Some are dead and some are living. My life, I love them all.
Again, like in the example using yesterday, it doesn't sound as good. I apologize for subjecting your ears to those modifications, some which may have been painful, but it demonstrates how important the use of these non-chord tones were in creating the sound of this melody that we all know and love. Non-chord tones don't have to exist within the scale of the prevailing key, by the way. They can also be chromatic or non-diatonic, such as the C note over the D minor chord in the last section of In My Life. In the song's key of A major, which contains the following notes, the third interval is normally C sharp, a major third, but the Beatles borrowed the C note outside of the key from the parallel minor scale, which contains the note C as its minor third interval, and made the C note an accented non-chord tone, which also really stands out when the rest of the song is in A major. The song Maria from the Broadway musical West Side Story also uses a chromatic note as a non-chord tone. It uses a diminished fifth or a sharpened fourth, which is normally a very tense note, but it sounds great in the context of the song.
Maria, 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 I've just met a girl named Maria.
I dropped the pitch of this live recording down a half tone, making the chord a D major for ease of analysis instead of a D sharp. The note G sharp is sung over that D chord, and some of the strings reinforce the vocalist's melody note as well for extra tension. Listen again, how that note wants to resolve immediately back to a tone within the chord. The Beatles song Get Back also uses chromatic non-chord tones beautifully. Also, it's in the same key as In My Life, A major. Though it does use a chromatic chord, G major, which is a flat 7th, as a passing chord frequently.
Jojo was a man who thought he was a loner, but he knew it couldn't last.
The word thought is sung as a G note, over an A major chord on the strong beat, which makes it sound like an A seventh chord, even though the band is only playing the major triad instead of the seventh. The next accented non-chord tone is an F-sharp note on the syllable low over the same A major chord, which ends up sounding like a brief A major sixth chord. There's more in the chorus as well, but we'll cut the examples short for variety's sake and video length. The most interesting accented non-chord tone in this song is the G note, as it creates the sensation of wanting to lead to the D major chord in the next phrase.
Jojo was a man who thought he was a loner, but he knew it couldn't last.
And now for your favorite part of the example. Here's what Get Back would sound like if it didn't have these accented non-chord tones.
Jojo was a man who thought he was a loner, but he knew it. Jojo was a man who thought he was a loner, but he knew it.
Eleanor Rigby is another great song that uses accented non-chord tones to create interest over a single chord that stays put for quite a few bars before it changes.
Eleanor Rigby picks up the rise in the church where a wedding has been. Lives in a dream, waits at the window.
In the verse, these accented non-chord tones give the melody a lot of color. Otherwise, it would blend in and become too mushy compared to the E minor chord if it didn't have the following non-chord tones. The words rice and church are sung using D and C sharp notes respectively, over E minor, which normally contains the notes E, G, and B, which sound like two separate new chords, E minor 7th and E minor 6th. Now, they are slightly syncopated as they fall just a little before the strong beats 1 and 3 in the way they are sung, but our brain still interprets that as accented notes and they stick out. Our brains have a good tolerance for syncopation and like to hear it. Otherwise, some melodies can sound robotic if they are exactly on the beats. Another interesting thing about these notes is that they sound like they are from the Dorian mode. The key of E minor's scale normally has the notes, which is called the natural minor or Aeolian mode. It's characterized by the minor 3rd and minor 6th. Whereas the Dorian mode has all the same notes except the major 6th degree before the minor 7th degree. The next non-chord tone is an A note on the word bin, over a C major chord on a strong accented beat, which normally contains the notes C, E, and G. And then finally, the C natural note shows up on the word dream, over an E minor chord again, which is also a strong accented beat. It's back in the natural minor mode. The song uses a combination of the Aeolian and Dorian modes, also called modal mixture. I'm going to skip over the chorus to move on to other examples, but you can see for yourself that both sections of the chorus or middle section that acts as a second chorus also has a lot of non-chord tones. And because the chorus is played right from the beginning in the song, its non-chord tones really stand out in the high positions as well. I have one more example from the Beatles I want to share before moving on to some other artists. It's a different type of accented non-chord tone than the previous examples, called a suspension. Not to be confused with suspended chords, that's a different topic. A suspension happens when one or more notes appear over a chord, and then a new chord appears under the same single note or group of notes when they are repeated or held. The new chord must not contain any of the tones of that repeated or held note from before, and that causes it to stand out. Golden Slumbers has a prominent example in the chorus.
Golden slumbers fill your eyes.
The syllables gold and in are both sung as E notes over a C major chord, which the repeated note is still part of the C major chord, containing the notes C, E, and G. but then the next word syllable slum is also repeated as an E. And the next chord that appears under that accented note is an F major triad, which contains the notes F, A, and C, creating a striking effect because E is not normally part of the chord. Before the E note resolves back to an A note on the burrs syllable, which is part of the normal F major triad. Like in the previous example of In My Life, it sounds like an F major 7th chord. And again, some sources will notate the chord as an F major 7th, but that's because of the illusion created by the accented non-chord tone, as the band is only playing a major triad, and the vocals are singing the extension. These cover recordings, by the way, are used because they sound as close as possible to the original recordings in the way they are played, so I can demonstrate these concepts. Other cover recordings will play those extended chords in the same error I described, though they still sound good, just not the original intended performances, though. Again, you'll find these techniques used all over many different Beatles songs. But aren't limited to just the Beatles, though. Plenty of other songs and songwriters have been influenced by the technique whether the writer was consciously aware of it or not. And that's how the Beatles learned it as well, by studying the songs they learned by ear and noticing these patterns, as I'll discuss later. Going back to non-chord tone suspensions, the song You Are So Beautiful has a similar accented non-chord tone in a suspension like Golden Slumbers.
You are so beautiful.
The part where the non-chord tone suspension occurs has syncopation in the timing of where the notes land, slightly after the beat. The word so is sung as a C note, over an A flat major 7th chord, just after the beat, which also contains the same note. Then on the next word, beautiful, the first syllable is also a C note, slightly after the first beat of the bar, over a D flat major chord which doesn't contain the C note, so it sticks out, before moving to the two next syllables, in which the second syllable is a B-flat note, that's a passing non-chord tone, and the last note, A-flat, is now part of the new chord and feels resolved. Even though the phrase is syncopated, we still hear the accented non-chord tone prominently.
You are so beautiful.
Made famous by Percy Sledge and later covered by Michael Bolton, the first few seconds of When a Man Loves a Woman also has a very prominent accented non-chord tone that's different than a suspension because the non-chord tone is not part of any of the two chords.
When a man loves a woman.
The words when A are sung as A notes over a G dominant 7th chord, which normally contains the notes G, B, D, and F. The sung notes are not part of the chord, and they aren't accented, so they don't really grab that much attention. It's not until the word man is sung and is split into two syllables, the first also being an A note, and the second a G note. The A note is an accented non-chord tone over the chord C major, which normally contains the notes C, E, and G. Then it resolves back to a G note. The chorus of the Talking Heads' classic Once in a Lifetime is so memorable because of its copious use of non-chord tone suspensions.
How did I get here?
At the end of each phrase, the words let the water, and the second iteration, water flowing, as well as After the Money, are involved in suspensions. Listen to the syllables let thee, sung as A notes, over the D major chord, and then the syllable wa is also sung as an A note, but the chord has changed to a G major, causing the accented A note to stand out. This repeats at the end of every phrase as mentioned earlier. And there is also another accented non-chord tone at the beginning of the phrase involving the E note on syllables, days, and blue, sung over the D major chord, on accented positions before resolving to an F sharp note.
How did I get here?
And for my last example, Seal also used a lot of non-chord tones in the verse from Kiss from a Rose.
There used to be a grand tower alone on the sea.
The words tower and alone both share D notes on their strong accents. And they fall on beats 1 and 4 in 6/8 meter, which are both accented. Note that the next bar of 9/8 meter in this song's context is used to elongate the ends of phrases, and still has strong accents similar to 6/8 meter. Now back to that D note that occurs over both E flat major and F major chords. None of which have any D notes, making the syllables stand out. Then the syllable lone moves to on, which are D and C respectively. The D note resolving to the C note over that F major chord releases the momentary tension in the melody.
Used to be a grand tower alone on the sea.
The next accented non-chord tone occurs in a high position.
You became the light on the dark side of me.
An F sharp note after the high G note. It's sung over a G major chord which normally doesn't contain an F sharp. The reason why the F sharp note feels accented is because the previous G note is very short. And then the F sharp note still catches the strong beat before it's held much longer over the G major chord. Regarding that F sharp note, another interesting thing about this song is that it's borrowing that note from a parallel major key, G major, which has the following notes. When much of the song is in the key of G minor, which has the following notes. You often hear both the major third B and the minor third B flat swapped around this song frequently. Also the major 7th, F sharp, and minor 7th, F natural, as well. In fact, you could consider it being in 2 simultaneous keys at the same time, which really creates a haunting sound. The chord progression especially reinforces this, switching between the major and minor tonic chord G major and G minor. The last non-chord tone I'll demonstrate for now is in the highest climactic position, which is in the verse rather than the chorus, interestingly. The highest note doesn't always have to be in the chorus, and there's many great songs that dispel that myth, which I'll discuss in a separate video.
Love remains undrawn as the high night.
The word love is broken up into 2 syllables, and the first one is sung as a high C note on a strong accented position, over the G major chord again, which the C note is not part of that chord. Then it resolves back to the B note, which is part of the chord.
Love remains undrawn as the high night.
You might also be wondering, how many accented non-chord tones should I use in a song that I want to try writing and experimenting with them? Well, I don't have an exact number to suggest, but based on these numerous examples, it seems that having at least a small handful of them in a few bars per section in a song is a good amount. Keep in mind that since phrase structures repeat a few times in a section, only a few unique accented non-chord tones will be multiplied in those emphasized positions. You don't want too many of them, as that could cause your melody to sound too dissonant and without direction or resolution, but the right amount will result in a beautiful melody that balances tension and resolution, just like in these examples. As mentioned earlier in this video, the usage of non-chord tones also wasn't invented by the Beatles, as demonstrated with these other brilliant classic songs. They just picked up the technique from absorbing works from the Great American Songbook and countless well-written songs that came before them. They unconsciously picked up the importance of how non-chord tones make a melody stand out from their voracious study of music by hearing and playing, even though they didn't read or write notation. Nor did they go to school to study music. It was all by ear, and their unconscious minds often synthesize new ideas from the vast mental library of songs they've learned. See for yourself in the documentary, Get Back, and how they cover so many classics, as well as Paul recounting how Yesterday was formed. It was in a dream, according to him, and that's where the unconscious mind can create ideas in the background based on your absorbed knowledge. Seal also learned the same way. In an interview with Rick Beato, where they discuss Kiss from a Rose, Seal said, "Nobody told me I couldn't do that," when Rick asked him about his many unique writing choices in the song. It also probably came from some of his many influences, including Neil Young and the Beatles, which both used many non-chord tones in their melodies. Seal has been known to cover their songs, and his performance of Young's song, Don't Let It Bring You Down, demonstrates how much appreciation and influence he took from him. Seal also said that parts of the song were written because it felt like the right choice to make, which demonstrates his intuitive understanding of dissonance and the effects these techniques create. I'll link the parts of the interview with timestamps in the video description, and they total about 7 minutes. I do recommend checking out the entire video though, as Kiss from a Rose is such an amazing song that deserves a lot of analysis and education from its brilliance. Stay tuned for more videos in which I'll be discussing even more tricks and techniques that make up a great melody, and how you can use them in your writing.